In this section, we're going to talk about IaaS, or Infrastructure as a Service, as it relates to Azure. Before we dive into that, we need to understand Azure virtual machines and their components. So to get started, Infrastructure as a Service, as it relates to Azure, is going to be Azure virtual machines. And what this means is it gives you full control over the operating system, just as if that virtual machine was residing in an on-premise data center. They support both Windows as well as Linux operating systems, and there are multiple sizes and types to support the variety of workloads or solutions that you're going to be deploying to them. So to get started with virtual machines, let's take a little bit of a step back. Originally, we had hardware, physical hardware that resided on-prem. This included the processor, the memory, as well as the storage. And on top of that, we installed an operating system. And then we had an application that ran on top of that. With virtual machines, we start with that same hardware. So we still have the same processing, memory, and storage options or storage resources that are presented. Except this time we install a hypervisor layer. And what this does is it's going to take all of those resources, again, that memory, CPU, and storage, and then we're going to create various operating systems or install the operating systems on top of that hypervisor. Those operating systems are not going to be able to tell that they're running on a hypervisor. They think they're talking directly to the physical hardware, just like they would in a traditional deployment. Those various operating systems are then referred to as virtual machines. So you have multiple virtual machines running on one physical piece of hardware. And the advantage to this is when your traditional deployment, there's going to be times when the application and the operating system are not using the full processing capabilities of the physical hardware. And by installing multiple operating systems or virtual machines on that same piece of hardware, you're going to be able to make more use of that hardware. So as one application might be idle, the other application could be running more extensive workloads. It's always a balancing act of application performance versus the density of applications and operating systems running on a piece of hardware. However, the benefits have proven themselves worth the effort. So now that we understand the premise behind a VM and understand the components or how it essentially works, when we move to Azure, talking specifically about Azure, there's multiple different VM types depending on the workload. You can see we've got a type A, which includes basic and standard workloads. You've got burstable workloads to where you might have a application that typically is going to be pretty low on CPU utilization, but might have those periods of time where it bursts or spikes up, and that's able to address that. You got general purpose VMs. You got those that are optimized for high memory applications, so the memory to CPU core ratio is much higher. You also have the opposite, where you have a higher CPU to memory core ratio available. And there's also the G, or Godzilla size, which is for very large databases or big data use cases. Additionally, there's also specialty VM types. You got your type H for high performance compute, or HPC. This is going to be for your specialized use cases, like, for example, molecular modeling or other scientific applications. You got your L type, which is storage optimized, so they have a much higher disk throughput and I/O. You've got your M type for large memory, and this allows you to assign much larger amounts of memory to a VM than might be typically available. In this sense, you can see we allow up to 3.5 terabytes of RAM to be assigned. Type N, we're GPU enabled, so if you've got a workload that would benefit from having GPU processing power available, this would be a VM type that you should consider. And then there's also the SAP HANA instance, which is purposely built and certified to run the SAP HANA application. We also have specializations within the various VM types to let you know that there's additional options or additional capabilities that you can assign to that virtual machine. For example, if it has the S in the name, that means premium storage is available, which gives you that option for premium SSDs, which again, higher throughput and IOPS. M type for larger memory configuration, so if you want to assign more memory to it or more memory is available to it. Or R for RDMA, so that the network card can talk to the application memory to help improve the application performance. With all that being said, it's very hard to tell how one type might benefit over the other or what the actual performance increase would be. So with that in mind, Azure created the ACU, or Azure Compute Unit. And this is a Microsoft-created benchmark that allows you to compare the CPU performance between different sizes and types of VMs. If you've got a VM that has an ACU of 200, that means it's going to have roughly twice the performance of a VM with an ACU of 100. With this in mind, if you had an application that was deployed to a resource that had an ACU score of 200, and you were looking to save some money with that resource, you could look at reassigning that application to a resource that had an ACU score of 150 or 175, testing the performance again, and then making a judgment call to see if that performance was worth the additional cost savings associated with the resource with the lower ACU score. Additionally, if you have a VM that is not performing as well as you'd like, you can look to see, okay, what resources are available with a higher ACU, and then plan on testing and reassigning as needed. So now that we've talked about the hardware, let's talk about the various operating systems that are supported within Azure. From a Windows Server standpoint, there's marketplace images for 2008 R2 on up. You can run a 2003 Windows Server, but you need to bring your own image. It's not available within the marketplace, and you also need to have a custom support agreement in place. From a desktop operating system, Windows 10 Pro and Enterprise are also available from the marketplace. From the Linux standpoint, there's a number of different distributions that are available. You've got CentOS, Debian, CoreOS, Oracle Linux, RHEL, so on and so forth. There's also the Ubuntu images that are available from the marketplace as well. So obviously there's some additional flexibility here. One thing to keep in mind too is there are multiple different operating systems that are available from within the Azure Marketplace from third-party vendors that are not created or maintained by Microsoft directly. Now that you've determined the operating system as well as the VM SKU size or hardware size you're going to deploy your solution to, one thing to keep in mind is there are some limitations as far as what VM SKUs or hardware sizes are available within given regions. As you can see here with the A8 through A11 compute-intensive resources or hardware SKU size, those are only available in the East, North, and South Central U.S. as well as the West U.S. So if this is something you are looking to deploy or leverage for your solution, those are the only regions which you can deploy to. If you're looking at the version 4 of the D series, you can see right now it's only available in preview in the East US 2, but it is looking at something they're deploying or going to be deploying to the other regions throughout the US and Canada in the near future. I've included a link at the bottom, so as you're getting ready to deploy your solution, you can check back to make sure that the given resource size will be available in the region that you desire. Microsoft also has a handful of usernames that are restricted and prohibited from use. Reason behind it is obviously there's a number of VMs that are going to be running in Azure, and in order to get access you have to know the username and password. Well, if you use a common username, it's going to make it that much more easier for someone to gain access to it just by guessing the password. So if your username is not default or not well known, it'll become that much harder for someone to gain access to that VM.